Very good. Well, good day, London, and good evening, Sydney. I'm Peter Murray, Chairman of New London Architecture, and this event is one of a series we have discussing issues about the built environment with cities around the globe, and we're very pleased to be talking with you today. We're talking around polycentric cities, a subject for research that we carried out last year. And we're very pleased to include in that aspects about the Sydney Plan 30-minute city. And we thought it would be a very useful discussion to join forces today to look at how we deal with growth in our city. And we've got a great lineup of speakers today to talk to us about that. Very grateful to Bates Smart hosting this in Sydney and supporting the programme, Diamond Schmidt Architects and KPF, as well as Wicona, who are programme supporters. From London, we have traditionally been a polycentric city, a central area surrounded by ancient, in some cases, but by towns with their own economies. But we have, over the centuries, actually focused very much on radial rather than orbital links between them, and the central activity zone has dominated very much the way that growth has been seen over history, but also in previous administrations in City Hall. This is now changing as we need to accommodate substantial growth, which you'll be hearing about later. London is, as Rasmussen called it, a scattered city. We have suburban areas which can accommodate some of the growth that we need to house in the city as we grow. And so these are issues to which you will hear about shortly and which we'll discuss on our panels. So I'd just say that on our programme it says Julia McLaughlin was one of the speakers, but she unfortunately is ill, and Darren Richards, who's interim head of the London Plan team, is here to talk about the London side of the plan. So I'm now pleased to pass over to Philip Vivian, who's director at Bates Smart. And so he's going to introduce the Sydney end of proceedings. Thank you. I hope.
From Sydney at NLA London to discuss London and Sydney as polycentric cities. Before we start, I thought I'd set the scene for our discussion about polycentric cities and provide some comparisons between Sydney and London. As you know, cities have become one of the defining characteristics of the 21st century.
predicted to grow to 11 million by 2041. And Sydney is predicted to 8 million by 2050. Greater London's metropolitan density is 64 people per hectare, while Greater Sydney has a density of less than half that at 29 people per hectare. Infrastructure is heavily weighted. The $23 billion Crossrail project is currently nearing completion. Meanwhile, Sydney's infrastructure expenditure is just starting to be rebalanced away from the private automobile and towards public transport, and I'm sure you'll hear more of that later, with construction commencing on the $14 billion Sydney Metro project. From a planning perspective, the Mayor of London's key diagram promotes growth through the economically challenged corridors of the Thames Gateway and the Stratfield-Stansted-Cambridge corridor. The Greater Sydney Commission has a vision of 3 cities where everyone is within a 30-minute drive of an employment centre. This is supported by a new aerotropolis at Badgerys Creek and the reinforcement of Parramatta as Sydney's geographic centre. Sarah Hill will tell you more about this vision shortly. And one final comparison. From a governance perspective, the Mayor of London has statutory authority over transport, economic development and planning, as well as fire and police, while Sydney's Greater Sydney Commission has no statutory authority and acts as an advisory body with a working agreement between transport, planning, education and health. So the challenge we have here with 2 cities anticipated to grow by 5.6 million people in the first half of this century is how to accommodate that growth in a form that is sustainable and equitable, reducing carbon emissions and increasing socio-economic equality. There is substantial evidence to suggest that compact, connected and coordinated urban growth built around mass public transport can create cities that are economically dynamic, healthier and have lower emissions. In London and Sydney, we are seeing the emergence of these dense polycentric clusters. In London, at Canary Wharf, Stratfield and Elephant and Castle, as well as many others, and in Sydney, we have Parramatta, North Sydney, Chatswood and St Leonards. Our challenge, certainly in Sydney, is to combat the NIMBY syndrome and local politics, to empower the Greater Sydney Commission to deliver a plan that will create a more sustainable and socially equitable city. On that note, I'd like to introduce Sarah Hill, the CEO of the Greater Sydney Commission, to tell us how she plans to achieve that challenge. Please welcome Sarah.
Thank you. And good morning, London, and good evening, Sydney. So great to be here. I'm going to walk and talk around as I like to do. So I'm just going to kick off by sharing with you a little bit about our vision for Sydney, some of the logic behind the structure of it, and absolutely where is the GSC heading going forward. So I might just bring up my slides if I can. Oh, okay, that's with me. In my hands. Here we go, perfect. So just like you, I thought I'd give some stats comparing our 2 cities, and I won't go over what's already been touched, but you'll see a couple of different figures here. In short, Greater Sydney is an enormous area comparative to most cities. When you include the metropolitan rural area, which may be considered similar to a green belt for Sydney in many respects, we're over 10,000 square kilometres in area. And when you look at our population on a density basis there, we're about 2,000 people per square kilometre. Once you take that MRA out, or once you put that MRA back in, then you start to reduce that population density. And it compares quite interestingly to London, just to see the differences between our 2 cities, and certainly the sheer scale of the city that we're actually planning today. We have some incredible opportunities. Growth presents a fantastic problem for a planner such as me, and we're certainly a growing city. In fact, by comparison, on average, over the next 20 years, we're growing at a population growth rate of about 1.9% per annum, compared to about 1%, I understand, for London. This translates into substantial growth for new dwellings, but also jobs within our city. Very much to your earlier point about equity, though, this is a challenge in our city, and the two images here show a disparity between opportunities across our cities. So those red and pink and blue dots on our map represent some of the highest performing education facilities in our city. And you'll see that they're largely concentrated around the North Shore, and those parts of Sydney which are traditionally higher socioeconomic areas, creating this line of opportunity or a line of diversity within our city that we're not too proud of. Some call it the latte line, some call it the smashed avocado line, some call it the goat's cheese curtain, but in effect it all amounts to the same thing that we need to address across our city. Another key input to our city is just this incredible diversity of movement across it. So traditionally, for those in London, the blue part of our city, the eastern cities where the Opera House is, the Harbour Bridge, and the economic powerhouse of Australia, very much the economic corridor and big driver of our economy, finance, jobs and education. And of course, this is where most of our jobs are currently attracted. It's the Corporation of London equivalent in Sydney. The red area might be the up-and-coming Canary Wharf, the second CBD of Sydney, the up-and-coming trendy area that's being regenerated and changed. And the yellow area is in effect the greenfield area, the Thames Gateway, if I can say that. So it might be a little bit of a bad comparison there, but certainly an area that is going to experience rapid change and has incredible opportunities. But you'll see from these figures here that the number of people travelling into that blue area is substantial, and this is jobs, total workforce, and about 55% of people in the yellow area live and work there, and 45% travel out every single day, sometimes 40, 50 kilometres to work, an extraordinary travel time, which is not ideal for living. This is one of my favourite maps. Yes, I'm a planning nerd, but I actually mapped all of the housing activity in Sydney today and over the next 5 years. And for the first time, we put all on the one map, all of the areas where government is intervening from a state point of view in opportunities, and that's largely in the blue areas. And quite frankly, you'll see everything's happening everywhere across Sydney at the same time, and we wonder why we have challenges trying to align infrastructure and growth. Pretty telling to me. So what did we do? Well, quite frankly, we looked at the mother of all polycentric city approaches, and we came up with three big core centres around that blue eastern harbour city, the red central or river city, and the western parkland city. But very much to your earlier point, London, about an orbital versus a polycentric city approach, one of the first things we did at the Commission is just look at the map and see the incredible mismatch of opportunities in terms of transport. In effect, everything in Sydney has been designed to travel into that blue area, and we wonder why we don't have a diversity of jobs. There was an obvious and stark missing part of our puzzle, which is really that yellow area that had no north-south rail line. And for the Cluey people out there, you would have seen this map re-released last year and the early kind of heads up that we were working on a north-south rail line and effectively the completion of a network across Greater Sydney for the first time. Now, this is a long-term vision. It costs an awful lot of money to make happen, but someone's got to have a vision to connect the dots in Sydney. So yes, our plan had two central organising themes, a 30-minute city and a polycentric city around three centres. Just a quick fact for those in Sydney, an interesting thing, we have about 40 major centres in Greater Sydney. We have 10 with over 10,000 jobs in each, pretty extraordinary when you compare it to our comparators such as Melbourne, which have a substantially smaller number of centres with a significant number of jobs. So one thing we did in preparing the plan was look back to 1908, 1948, 1968, and one thing we've done consistently well is plan for centres across the city. And that's something that we don't choose to throw away. That's something that is really the bones of our city that our planners have done well. A critical element of our work, though, is building on a platform of the 10 directions that we released last year, the foundation for not only our plan, but the transport strategy and the state infrastructure strategy. which really feed into that light blue colour. Then we prepared the district plans, that next layer down of planning, and now our big job is to complete the network, to complete the whole hierarchy of plans, working with local councils to complete local environment plans or local plans in a London sense. So that alignment's critical. Key themes in the plan, building on those 10 directions, around the GSC's core strategy of livability, productivity and sustainability, that little objective that I have to improve all as the city grows in my legislation. But one thing we heard loud and clear from people over the last 2 years of listening to Sydney-siders is that we needed to include infrastructure and collaboration in that process. Because as the city grows, we need to have the infrastructure to support it. If I had $1 for every time I heard that, I certainly wouldn't need to be working anymore and doing what I'm doing. It is absolutely critical, and mums and dads and people who didn't even know what infrastructure wasn't a word in their lexicon 10 years ago, are now crying out for it. Critical to what we do. We built on those themes, and very much around that point of agglomeration also raised earlier, built on some of the key elements in our city. An interesting comparative stat, Greater Sydney is the second biggest exporter of higher education in the world, second only to London. So we've really built on these education and health precincts, focusing and working with state government, with the private sector, the tertiary education universities, to really focus on them and build our university towns, our towns that are over 200 years old across the Western City, giving them something to really, really generate and provide for the next generation of Sydney-siders. It's also about livability, about what makes great places, about fine-grained places, socially connected spaces, because we know that over the last 2 years we've been preparing strategies, we've been preparing plans, we've been preparing policies on affordable housing and industrial lands, but what people want is great outcomes. They need more of everything, but things done well, and this is about a livable city as much as one that is more prosperous. And in fact, they're hand in hand, really, aren't they? The other thing we did is look at a city within its topography, look at a city in its form and its water catchment, looking at the different ways that Sydney as a natural city already works. And interestingly, for those in Sydney at the moment, you'll see that lighter peach colour on the plan, showing very much the water catchment all transferring out into the sea. That's how we traditionally built our water systems, but our water systems are now getting to the end of their economic life. We've sweated those assets. And if we're going to put 2 million more people in that dark peach area, in that South Creek catchment, we need to do things differently. We can't keep pumping our sewage out to the ocean. We need to really start to think better about new ways of doing, of managing our water and enhancing our environment. So South Creek is a central organising theme in that parkland city that we're actively working on at the moment. New typologies for urban form, new ways of actually working with our natural environment to build our new city. And then, of course, really translating that down into how it works on the ground in that finer grain. Now, bringing it together all on one plan was critically important. In fact, bringing together one transport strategy approach, one planning approach, one infrastructure approach was my mission for the year. Last year, this year, it's about making it all happen. And the Western Sydney City deal, for those in London, similar to a Manchester or a Glasgow City deal, is something that we released in the last couple of weeks, something we're very proud of, tying together 8 local councils in Western Sydney, the state government and the Commonwealth government to make that happen. So that's a really critical first step in being able to achieve the vision of our plan. The other thing we need to do to make our plan a reality is a series of new ways of doing things, a focus on implementation. This is not a plan that's going to sit on the shelf if I've got anything to do with it. This is a plan that we need to collaborate on to implement and not just only design. This is a plan that actually requires GSC as an independent organisation to give assurance to the community that things are being planned well. More on that to come. This is a plan that actually is not just about more, it's about better quality outcomes. And it's a plan that tries to do things differently. And for another day, I'd share with you the approach of growth infrastructure compacts. But last but not least, a plan that actually reinvigorates parts of Greater Sydney that we've forgotten, such as South Creek I mentioned earlier. So I think that's a 13-minute wrap-up of Sydney's next 40 years. For those of you who've heard me tell the story before, I'm really happy to answer any questions later on. Thanks, London. Thanks, Sydney.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for an excellent description of what you're planning in Sydney. And now we're going to hear from Darren Phillips, Interim Head of London Plan and Growth Strategies at the Greater London Authority, who's going to bring us up to date with what's happening in London.
Thank you, Peter. So, let's hope this technology works. Well, hey, right. Yes, apologies from Julie Emma. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it this morning, so I've stepped in. I am the interim head of the London Plan team, so I am responsible for managing the London Plan and the process. We've just finished the consultation period on that plan. An observation about the title, London a polycentric city. I think there's a question mark missing at the end of that, as we'll see from some of these maps around the city. So just to give a bit of context, perhaps more for our colleagues in Sydney, about where London fits within the wider region. So you've got the pale area in the middle is the Greater London area. We have to remember that it's an accident of geography formed in 1965, and it was very much a discussion around who wanted to be within London and who didn't. You then got the lighter blue area around it, which we call the outer metropolitan area, which is where London draws a huge number of commuters every day. And then the wider southeast area, which is the dark blue area, which is areas stretching down to Portsmouth and up to Norfolk, which is the wider area that influences London. So the question is whether accidents of geography mean that actually the polycentric city, is it Greater London Authority, is it the outer metropolitan area, is it the wider area? The economy functions as if that whole area was part of a wider functioning economic area. Now, turning to London, most of you will be familiar with this, but 33 London boroughs. There are actually 35 planning authorities in London, because we also have the two development corporations. We've got the London Legacy Development Corporation and the Old Oak Park Royal Development Corporation. So they're all planning authorities. Important distinction, the Mayor's not a planning authority, but he's a strategic planning authority. So he doesn't handle lots of planning applications, but he has the power to take them over. But what he does have the power to do is prepare a strategic plan, a statutory strategic plan for the whole of London. In terms of those sub-areas that the plan is planning for, London sort of separates into three different areas. So the grey area in the centre is what we call the central activities zone. And that's where the focus is of most of our office employment, the government functions, a lot of our higher education, a lot of the cultural facilities all in that area. We have special policies for that area to protect its function, because it is generally an office and employment area, and we don't want that to be affected by, for example, significant residential development. We then have what we call inner London, which is the main the boroughs surrounding that area, generally zones 1 to 2. And that's where most of London's growth over the last 10 to 15 years has been occurring. There is a high density of transport opportunities there, and it's where we've been able to get significant high density development. You then have outer London, the green areas. This is where most of London's population live, but these are the traditional London suburbs, generally built in the 30s to a low density. And this is the area I'm going to focus on a bit more in terms of how this new London plan is trying to change the way we plan London and where development and high density growth should be going. It's also important to remember in terms of growth in employment over the period to 2041, over a third of growth is going to be employment. We're going to go by 31%. Over half of that growth will be still in CAS, in the central activity zone. So again, question mark, is London a polycentric city? Now, as has already been mentioned, the challenges we face around population growth. So by 2041, we estimate London's population will be around over 10 million, 10.8 million, past its previous peak a couple of years ago. So that means we need a new plan. So when the Mayor was elected, with a new manifesto, he directed us to prepare a new plan that reflected both his commitments in his manifesto and the challenges we face in terms of a growing London. And he's been very clear that this is a break from previous plans. So the plan's different in its tone. It's much more directive. It's more detailed in terms of the policies. We can do this because it is part of the statutory development plan in London. So in terms of development, they have to take account of this plan as well as the plans that the boroughs prepare, their local plans. Set of principles around how we see growth happening in London. So 6 good growth policies that are set out. So building strong and inclusive communities, so making sure we've got things like the schools, the health facilities, the social infrastructure we need for a growing London. Making the best use of land. So this is about encouraging higher density, encouraging intensification, co-location of employment and residential uses, so we make the city, make land work harder. Creating a healthy city. This is about making sure that we are dealing with the air quality issues we have in the city, that we're providing the health facilities for a London that is growing older. We're going to have more older people in London, so that's going to have its challenges around creating a city where they can get around. Delivering the homes Londoners need. Now, this is a key challenge. It's one of the priorities for the Mayor. We do a thing called a SHMA and a SHLA, which are assessments of housing need and housing capacity. We think we need about 66,000 new homes a year. We've got capacity for about 65,000, and I'll go on to say where we think we find that capacity. Growing a good economy. So this is not only about supporting those jobs that I mentioned they're going to grow in the CAS, it's also about an industrial land. So we've done some studies around our industrial capacity, around logistics, around light manufacturing. We've been losing too much of that land, and the policies of the plan strengthen to ensure that we don't lose as much, and that where we do look at industrial land, we're thinking about how we can intensify it. Can we have multi-storey warehouses? Can we use the land better? Can we co-locate with residential where it's appropriate and where those uses? And finally, efficiency and resilience. This is about dealing with climate change. The Mayor has a commitment to make sure London is zero carbon by 2050, and a number of policies in the plan to support this. Now, in terms of, you did see earlier the old key diagram, which I argue wasn't really much of a key diagram, it didn't tell you where things were happening. This new key diagram for the new London plan does tell you where things are happening. It's based around the growth corridors, it's based around corridors where we are improving, there's existing or improved transport links. So you can see major opportunity areas, which are our key areas of growth, generally of brownfield sites, brownfield land with significant capacity for new homes and jobs. We've got 9 new opportunity areas in this London plan. You probably can't see them. I'm going to give a bit of detail in those in a moment. But you can see, in terms of the kind of corridors we're looking at, we've got Thames Estuary, we've got the Elizabeth line, both east and west, and we've got potentially in the future Crossrail 2 to the north and to the southwest. And making the most of those means providing more guidance about what will happen in those areas. So here we have the Thames Estuary, a significant development, a long-standing development. We're about halfway through what is probably a 70-year programme in this area. But as you can see, significant opportunities for development in this area. And just to think about London in its context, we are working very closely with the authorities in North Kent and South Essex around how improved transport links both within and outside London can unlock growth in those areas. Our other main opportunity areas around Old Oak Park Royal, which is the fulcrum of this opportunity area, the Elizabeth Line West. So Old Oak Park Royal there in the top right-hand corner. It's where HS2 meets Crossrail. Significant opportunities for development, and going back to the point about polycentric cities, significant opportunity for redeveloping for office and employment development. It's seen as one of our reserves of office capacity if we can no longer find the capacity in the central activities zone. At the moment, we've got Stratford, which is building and which is becoming a major office location. But in the future, we think that Old Oak has the potential because of its transport links, and this is the key, that the agglomeration look for these key hyper-connected areas. Old Oak is one of those areas. Just to go back to housing targets, so one of the big changes to this plan is there's more housing capacity expected from the outer boroughs, those suburban boroughs. We're doing that through a new small sites policy. So where there are sites that are in town centres or within 800 metres of a station or a tube station, or within 800 metres of a town centre, we're expecting to see higher density development and smaller sites coming forward at higher densities. And this may mean that prevailing character of those areas will change. And it's about moving from a London of 8 million to a London of 10 million people means changes in those areas. So you can see there, the darker the red, the higher those targets, and they are increasing in outer London. And the other thing we do in the plan is identify the town centre network. So here we have international, you can see in the centre of London, but we have metropolitan centres, our main town centres in our outer London areas. You can see those spread around. And again, they are the focus for both office and employment development. And just quickly, the way we implement this, so major issue around infrastructure. We know there are issues in London around water resources, around energy capacity. So we prepared an infrastructure plan, 2050, which we produced an update last year. And the idea is that we need to look at the investment case for sustainable growth. And one of the issues around integration, making sure that as development happens, we get the energy authorities, the water goes in at the time that the development is happening. Picture there, the Olympic Park, where there was a very clear effort to make sure the utilities were in there first so they could service the development. That doesn't necessarily happen in some of our major development areas. And you might hear Gordon can mention some headaches around Battersea and power and how you get the power networks in. So we're putting together, looking at the need, but also looking at how we integrate that. We're setting up a high-level group to look at the integration of all of the utilities to make sure they talk to each other. So we're going to set up this infrastructure and development coordination group. And then the other thing we're doing is we've got a mapping. So we're going to map where all these utilities are actually doing their work. You'd be surprised that actually some utilities don't know the water, don't know when the energy are going to dig up the road. So we've got a mapping facility to make sure that all utilities and developers know where where improvements are happening and where development's happening, so that we place in one place all the infrastructure requirements that are needed for London. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren.
8 minutes isn't very long, is it?
And pleased to invite Chris Johnson. Chris Johnson is Chief Executive Officer at Urban Task Force Australia, who's going to talk about Sydney's opportunities and challenges. Chris, over to you.
Peter, thank you very much. It was great to see that sort of presentation, both of Sydney and of London. I'm coming from a slightly different position, however. I'm not part of government. I used to be part of government. I'm now representing the development industry, the people striving to try and make projects happen to house future people living in Sydney. So I'm going to talk a bit about this in a fairly current manner. This drawing came out as part of the package that Sarah was talking about on Sunday, a few days ago Sunday. And it's amazing that the orange dot on the right, Greater Sydney today at 5 million people has 410 people per square kilometre. But the government's diagram shows two orange lines swinging round to Greater London. So clearly on Sunday they were looking ahead at this very talk tonight. But London has got 8.7 million people at 5,800 people per square kilometre on this New South Wales government diagram. Now this is a big shift. If Sydney's going to really move from 410 to 580, 5,800, that's a dramatic thing. But people don't like it. This also came out on Sunday. The Sun Herald paper in Sydney had sick of the big squeeze. New polls show Sydney voters think overcrowding is ruining the city. They had a survey, overdevelopment. Do you think overdevelopment is harming the character of Sydney's suburbs? 60.6% said yes. So we've got a dilemma here. There's a nice diagram showing how we need increased density. The plans that Sarah showed are very much predicated on this, but there's a community reaction that's very negative about it. Now, my role is often to spruik the future, to talk about more exaggerate perhaps ways we could move. This is a diagram in one of the publications I put out showing the growth of Sydney's CBD. It goes from 1880, number A, right up to the orange structure in the middle, where H is, which is Centre Point Tower. But in 1977, the whole city stopped growing and had to be underneath that height. So the whole city stopped growing in the dynamic way it has been growing. And the reason I'm raising this is I think the whole future, in a way, is a metaphor about height. Density only works, in my opinion, with a reasonable amount of height. What we did to open up a dialogue on this is ask 3 architectural firms, including Bates Smart, to give a vision for what Sydney could look like in 2050. Now, this is pretty dramatic compared to what the city's like at the moment. These are 600-metre high towers. Philip Vivian was the author of this. This is where there's new metro stations and trying to, again in a metaphoric sort of fashion, show the Manhattanisation of Sydney. We are a peninsula city sitting out into the water. We had a number of schemes. Richard Francis Jones produced one that tried to balance the green and the landscape with the heights of buildings, solar access planes to the green to define where buildings occurred, or James Fitzpatrick, a more polycentric approach. This is to the main city centre in different spots around the harbour with maybe a circular line underneath all of that. And this came out in this publication. So what I've been trying to do is stimulate debate about the future of the city in its total sense by putting publications out like this, getting into the media and open up diagrams about this. Another one we did is about towers and transport. Now, I did this because the previous Minister for Planning said to me, Chris, it's best not to use the word tower, that the community is a bit worried about this word. So I've tried to link towers to transport, and this is very much about linking the future of the city into those areas. In this publication, I did 3 versions of how we could double the number of homes in Sydney over 50 years. The first was to double the footprint. Same density, 410 people per square kilometre, spread over the mountains is impossible. I mean, it's just not possible, and their commute times would be disastrous. Second was to double the density across the whole of suburbia. That is, current 2-storey houses would get 6-storey, 4-storey townhouses, maybe apartment buildings in their streets. That whole character, which is very loved by many people, as you could see from the 60% who are worried about the change, is impossible, I think, to achieve. But the third, which is to locate growth in centres and corridors, polycentric, but many, many centres, I think is the way to go. So we produced this image looking down as you fly into Sydney, that the green is the rail network. And the rail network then has lots of centres springing up at the main points as we move along the whole city centre platform. And this government, to its absolute credit, has moved into a metro system, is getting a better fast rail system happening across the city itself. So we did images of Parramatta, and Parramatta is booming. It's got a lot of towers, nowhere near this many, I must say, but this is the potential that Parramatta can get. This is the potential that Liverpool, a little bit further out, could achieve. And you could see other city centres in the background. Backtown is not quite as big a centre, but equally it's got the potential to get a whole lot of towers in it as well. And even just about 2 weeks ago, the city of Campbelltown, which is a bit further out, came up with their own vision to reimagine the future of Campbelltown. It's currently 2 or 3-storey buildings. They're proposing 20 stories. So suddenly, as a spin-off from where the Western Sydney Airport is going to be located, cities like Campbelltown are seeing a future that is big and tall and very urban. So this whole approach of getting a link between railway stations and the apartments and the growth and things is delivered a lot by members of my organisation, the Urban Task Force, developers doing things. Here's one by Crown Group, Green Square, apartment building, shops, retail, and in the middle you can see the entrance to the railway station. Out at Sydney Olympic Park, just like you've got your Olympic site in London, quite tall apartment buildings. The yellow line is the railway station building up around this, and there's a proposed metro station that will be happening here as well. So this led to another publication I did in 2015 called Density and Infrastructure. Clearly we've got to relate these two issues if the city's going to grow from 5 million up to 8 million. And so I said there's a 3-step process. What we really need is a long-term metro circle line and a central line. In fact, it's copying the London metro system. A circle line and a central line is ideal, I think, to structure the future form of Sydney as a city. And then we said there could be a series of light rail loops that could come out of these centres, feeding in to these major metro things. We also tried to connect, in this diagram, the 2 airports so that you had a relationship between those two. And then the third item in this diagram was to add housing density along these infrastructure routes. Along the metro, along the light rail route is where the bigger buildings probably around the metro, smaller buildings around the light rail, 6 to 8 stories perhaps, but trying to give a relationship between this infrastructure and where density goes. And to the credit of the various plans put out on Sunday, which included transport, infrastructure and planning, there is a good relationship being built up about this. And in fact, this is from the transport plan. This is the 40-year version of how the metro system and the rail system could come out, which in fact does have a central line and a circle line starting to happen within it. But there's a big problem Sydney has, and that is about a housing crisis. Housing affordability is a major issue in Sydney, and I'm sure it is to some extent in London. But I think Sydney is one of the leading areas in this regard. This is by Demographia, which links the least affordable cities from 1 down to 92. Number 1 is Hong Kong, but number 2 is Sydney. Sydney has 12 times the average family income required to buy the average house. And this is creating a major problem in Sydney about how people can live and where they can actually live. But this is a very interesting diagram as well. The average house in Sydney on the right-hand side, a year ago, it's about the same now, $1.123991 million. But the average apartment on the left-hand side, $711 million. So there's a difference of $400,000 for buying an apartment over a house. What's happening is a big swing towards apartment living, which is driven partly by affordability. We've done the most recent document in February 2018, this year, about Sydney's emerging lifestyles. So we're a city that is moving from a low-rise suburban character to becoming more urban, to becoming more global like London, New York, Paris, and those cities. And we did this by looking at the 2016 census and doing a survey of 1,500 people to get some idea of where the city's going. This is the shrinking proportion of detached homes in Sydney. So in 1991, 68% of our homes were detached. By 2016, in the census, it was down to 55%. On the current projections of approvals will be down to 49% by 2024 and could well be down to 25% by 2057, 40 years' time. But the apartments was 21%, up to 30, 34, potentially 50%. So there's a fundamental shift in the way a city like Sydney is going to grow and change towards how we live. So we did quite a lot of surveys from the census, etc., about the difference between apartment dwellers and house dwellers. They're younger, 46% over 33. They're actually more educated, which is quite amazing, that having a base degree and a second degree, 54% of apartment dwellers have that, 40% of house dwellers. Born outside Australia, and you'd understand this, that 42% over 25%. Many of our immigrants from different Asian countries particularly are very comfortable in apartments. Public transport users 78 to 50, walking to shops 23 to 9, commuting by train. So there's a fundamental shift in attitude coming with these people. So what we've done is we've looked into who are the people now living in apartments. And they are, as I say, 30% of homes across Sydney. In 1991, the orange is the one to watch, I think, 14% were families. Most people didn't think families were the big issue. In fact, 41% were single people living in apartments. By 2016, the families are up to 20% and the solos down to 34%. Projected by 2024 to go to 24%, and adjacent to that, the blue is one-parent families. So a third of people living in apartments will be families. Changes very much the character of those buildings and the sort of facilities that go with them. But we also asked, what were the three most influential factors for you when you choose to live in your current home as an apartment, and broke it down to these 5 groups who live in apartments. Access to public transport is crucial. So this relationship between public transport and density and a shift away from the house to the apartment is a very important issue. Affordability, and I mentioned the $400,000 difference in price average, is a very big driver as well, particularly for that green group, which is group households, where a number of people are sharing a house. Safety, security, lifestyle, and local schools. The blue is the one-parent families. Obviously, they want to be close to schools and to childcare. So I want to end, as we sort of wrap this up, about some other initiatives that we've put into play to say how the city can grow and move into a positive direction. One is to get faster approvals for mid-rise apartments. At the moment, the planning system is very long and slow to get approvals through. There's talk about the missing middle as being townhouses and terrace houses. We believe, however, that the 6-storey type model, 4 to 6 stories, is really what Sydney can handle in a better way. It means you've got to have lift, so older people downsizing can well live in these types of buildings. But at the moment, it takes just as long as any other building. So faster approval would be very useful to help get more of that. Even though the apartments are cheaper than the house, we believe there's still a potential to have more affordable. The micro apartments in New York and other places need to be looked at so people can get their leg up into a first home in the apartment world at much cheaper prices. And the government's starting to look at this, which is a really good sort of thing. But the affordability is a crucial issue. So we put up proposals to the government, and the plans that Sarah's put out have quite a bit about this as well, as to how our members can help with affordability. We've suggested that if a bonus, 20% of floor space is given to developers, that 20% could be affordable homes for a 10-year period, rental and return back. This would give 40,000 affordable homes over 10 years in Sydney. These are the sort of issues that need to be looked at to try to really help affordability across Sydney. The formulas everyone's talked about for housing affordability across Sydney are only for apartments, not for houses at all. So apartments are the key to the future of the city. And we also put this out about a new Sydney style. I mean, should all cities look the same? Should we have something special and different? We've got beautiful flowing beaches and rivers, something that relates to this is a good discussion to have as well, I believe. But this is what's happening. We're 1 year off an election. This is one of the local members down in Macquarie Fields. Tell the Liberal government we've had enough of overdevelopment. This is going to happen more and more over the next year as the election gets closer. Stop the squeeze. Tell the Liberal government we've had enough of overdevelopment. So we're reaching a dilemma here where the community is tense about this. I think there needs to be much stronger leadership about how we move into a new mode of living and link that to public transport. And this is what our members have got as a dilemma. They're finding it harder and harder to find somewhere to build their projects. They're now floating across Sydney looking for somewhere to land. We need this sort of accommodation, but it's finding it very hard to get through the broad planning system. It's a threshold we're reaching as a city. I think the plans that have been produced are going to help drive some of this. The worry I have is the political agenda, which will be worried about change, as you can see from a number of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and an excellent segue into now our next speaker, Stuart Robinson, Strategic Planning Advisor of Commercial Development at Transport for London, who's looking at densifying around transport centres. So we look forward to hearing your comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter, and good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. Delivering the polycentric city. Well, what struck me as quite interesting listening to the two sides, the two presentations from either side of the world, is that where Sydney is now, and where Sarah was talking about, infrastructure being very much at the top of the agenda, is where we were probably 10, 15 years ago. We've had an awful lot of infrastructure, and what seems to be on the top of people's agenda now is actually delivering the housing. So the big challenge for London is moving this housing around the transport nodes, which we've actually created through the infrastructure provision. And just for the benefit of people in Sydney, you may think, well, in terms of implementation, why is there somebody from Transport for London? It's true, we're mainly a transport operator. We're also a regulator, but we also have a planning authority, and I'm going to talk about the Mayor's transportation strategy, and a property developer. And of course, we're linked with Darren. We sit in the same GLA family, and we've been working on the London plan together. But rather uniquely, we're also becoming a property developer, because as the plan points us towards developments around the transport network, so it just so happens that we have a lot of land held by Transport for London around that transport network. And as the London plan, as Darren has indicated, focuses the minds of developers around within 800 metres of stations, so our land comes into play. And we've got an awful lot of it. We've got 5,700 acres, divide by 2 for the hectares, and that gives you an awful lot of potential for the capital's housing crisis, and that's all in about 270 sites. So, but going back to the actual planning aspects, one of the key things that we've come up with in relation to working with the GLA is the Mayor's transportation strategy, and the key thing about that is the 2 of the 3 points that you'll see in the bullet point below. Firstly, the whole healthy streets agenda. That's absolutely key to the way that we wish to develop London, and the key for leveraging good quality housing under the item 3 that you see there. And the why that is so important is because our infrastructure plan is about, we're not building any more roads. In fact, we're actually constraining the roads to make the environment better, to give more opportunities for people who want to walk to work, or walk to their transport node, who want to cycle. And by doing that, our aim is to change the modal split so that 80% of trips will be by non-private car by 2041. That's an ambitious target, but we've already changed that from 10% in only 15 years, in that we're already at that 2/3 mark, as you'll see from the circle there on the left-hand side. So how are we doing this? What is this Healthy Streets thing all about? Well, it's actually working to make them more attractive, more enticing for people who want to actually use their legs. It's obviously more healthy for them, and challenging obesity is obviously a common problem now in city cultures. So, and in doing that, that really focuses on the main public transport nodes, and means that we have an opportunity of building around these public transport nodes, whether they're simply bus stands or the tube network or rail stations. And as I said, Transport for London has got an awful lot of land around the public transport nodes. So we've been set some pretty ambitious targets by the Mayor in order to help start releasing that land for housing. I mean, we are quite unique as a UK public sector organisation in that we actually know what we own. And that's something which has taken rather a long time, but we're there now, and we've now got a plan to exploit the potential of that land. So 10,000 homes in the next 3 years will be put onto the market, which we'll develop with our joint venture partners, and there are 13 of those, and they will include people in Sydney will already know. 50% of that's the target, that's the Mayor has given us. 50% of that has to be affordable. But at the same time, because we're losing public subsidy from the government, yes, we're the only major transportation body which doesn't have a subsidy from central government, so we've got to put some of that revenue back into the coffers to run our transportation system. So we're building up a property development portfolio that will be develop an income. That also, as we develop around stations, we'll be hoping that we can use some of the development profit to provide things like step-free access and other benefits for customers using the bus or rail network. And finally, we've got to create good places. And this is absolutely fundamental, because if we don't create good places, then people won't want to live there, won't want to invest in there. And that's very much central to our philosophy. So quick breeze through the development pipeline. These are sites that are already been put out to market last year. This was the first part of our programme. So there you see 5 sites with 1,000 homes, mainly around the sort of inner central part of London. The next tranche, this is our year to date. We've now put out 2,250 housing sites. And as you can see, some of those now in the outer areas where, as Darren was explaining, about half of the housing growth is going into those outer borough areas. The next tranche, which goes out next month, is really interesting because that's populated by station car parks out in the suburbs. Now, this is where some of the issues that Chris has just mentioned, we think will come out to the fore, because we will be building a lot of apartment blocks. Apartment blocks are considered alien by a lot of people who actually live out in the suburbs, in the semi-detached suburbia. We'll be having a lot of apartments, which again in an area which is more used to houses. We'll also be taking away car parks in order to provide building sites, which will mean a lot of angry people who currently drive to the station. And also, the housing that we will provide will also not have car parking. So there'll be a lot of people who will be living next to the stations who will be thinking, well, where are these guys going to park? So all of those issues, and the fact that we'll be developing a fairly high rise, will be focusing on people's attention. So that's the main, I believe, is going to be one of the main challenges. In terms of the development pipeline looking forward, as you can see, we're looking at all of the infrastructure assets to try and exploit the development prospects. And here is, in a microcosm, the development pipeline, which I've just been talking about. And you can see that there's a high focus of that now on the outer boroughs and the outer suburban areas. So the polycentric city will be coming alive. And I'd just finally like to talk about Morden, because that's probably one area where we're very excited in realising the concept of a polycentric city, because this is not too many Mordenites here, but maybe not one of London's gems at the moment, but there's a real opportunity to provide new homes, new jobs around a new public space, good quality placemaking, hopefully, new retail opportunities and greater permeability around the town. But I come back to this thing about the legacy must be good places, because that's what's driving the economy. That's what's driving the answers to the housing crisis and also people's quality of life. So, in summary, we've just heard London's growing more quickly than ever before. We've got to accommodate a lot of people. We have a new London plan and a transportation strategy which is concentrating on good growth. And by good growth, we mean healthy streets connecting to good quality places. We want to bring our land, the TfL land, forward to help realise that, but it's only part of the answer. The housing growth will have to double in outer London in order to meet the ambitions of the polycentric city that we've been talking about and to make any impact at all on the terrific housing crisis that we're currently facing. But as I say, I'm going to focus, and I'm not going to apologise back, as the final comment, it must be good quality places. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Stuart. And now we're going to have a discussion about some of those issues, and we've got panels both at London and in Sydney. And in London, I'd ask to come up to the platform our speakers, plus Richard Brown, who's Research Director at Centre for London, and Gordon Adams, Head of Planning at the Battersea Power Station Development Company. And in Sydney, our panel will be Sarah and Chris, plus Alice Thompson, Cities Director at KPMG, and Tim Williams, Head of Cities at Arup. And so I'll now pass over to Sydney to kick off the discussion.
Thanks, Peter. We'll just get settled here.
All right.
So perhaps we could start off by, I'd like to ask Tim and Alice to share their experiences of Sydney and London. Specifically, how do you see Sydney moving forward to become a 30-minute city? And what do you think Sydney can learn from London's experience? Perhaps we'll start with Alice.
So I found something quite similar between the presentations was really this focus on the suburbs. So I think in some aspects we are a 30-minute city in many parts of the Sydney metropolitan area. When you actually look at the jobs growth, we like to concentrate on the high rate of growth that's actually been in the CBD. But when you look at the sheer numbers, a lot of this has actually occurred outside of the CBD, but it's far more diffuse and dispersed, and that also represents different challenges in how one might connect and what kind of transport solutions, particularly when in some areas you might actually see people, government objectives to have a mode shift from cars to public transport, but you actually might have people enjoying travel times in cars in the suburbs to their jobs that are far less than, say, what I experienced coming into the CBD. So I think one is we really need to understand some of the evidence. So the 30-minute city is a relatively new concept for Sydney, and what it does, it provides you with a different lens to look at the problems and to understand where that is and where that isn't. And then what gives you a new lens to have some different options about how you might actually intervene in that going forward. So we had a set of a transport and an infrastructure strategy that were released with the Greater Sydney Plan last week. What I saw within that was, there was an embracement of that kind of concept, but when you actually looked at some of the transport priorities, forgive the pun, they tended to still follow some of the same old tracks. When you're given something like a 30-minute city, really the optimum would be to lift up the network, to lay it down using the data, the analytics, to inform where and what you do, and understanding that that's probably a far more fine-grained, particularly in the Australian city, measure of transport. There's some trunk routes, there's a whole lot more dispersed there. But there was a lot of processes that were set into play within those strategies that I think are going to shed light and to start to identify different, particularly transport priorities that are really going to be driving that 30-minute city forward.
Great. Thanks, Alice. Tim?
It's a very important conversation for me because I spent 13 years working in East London, and coming here, I kind of thought maybe Western Sydney was a kind of version of East London. And I'm delighted to see the focus on Western Sydney as a big part of Sarah's plan. I think what comes across though is there's polycentric and there's polycentric, right? Sydney is vast in comparison with London. It's 5 times the size. It's half the population. But we're on a journey from a suburban to an urban city. And I think the problem, with the plans at the moment, because I think great progress has been made, is the transport underpinning for to move to an urban city of 8 million. There has to be a more decisive modal shift in our mind. The London example is essentially transport-led development. What we seem to be into is development-led transport. So I think we've got to really change the mindset. Now, we're on our way with the Greater Sydney Commission plan, but I think our ambition has to be raised even further. You see the London stuff and you just think to yourself, land use and transport integration is a great principle. What it actually means is a mass public transport network for Sydney of the kind that we haven't got, we need to have. And if we try to grow the city in a polycentric way without that network, we're just reinforcing sprawl. And just to put it in context for people in London, Parramatta, our central city, geographically is like Croydon in relation to CBD of London, i.e. it's right at the edge of London. And we've got a very difficult geography where our CBD is kind of Hammersmith versus Basildon in terms of where people live and work. So you you've got to take the jobs and the housing closer together. Normally you do that through mass public transit. I don't see the ambition at the moment or the strategy for that. And I think the last thing is about funding it all. So I think the challenge ahead is we need to move towards this tightened up city where Parramatta is brought to 10 or 15 minutes, a rail journey to central Sydney. Where do we get the money for the public transport journey that we need? And I think everybody is talking about value capture as an approach. And I'd be very interested to know in London whether that kind of value uplift stuff is actually a serious strategy that they're pursuing in London.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Yes, Sarah.
Add on to that, because I agree with Tim, the challenges and the realities are in Western Sydney, we have an area where 2 million more people will be moving in, and I don't have a single north-south rail line connection for at least another 10 years or so. It's pretty extraordinary. One of the things we did right at the start was actually work with our friends at Treasury and INSW to model different scenarios for the city. And a lot of people wonder about the 3 cities approach and why we didn't focus around an eastern city or an eastern and a central city, why we had to go to the 3. In effect, we need to build over 35,000, actually we're up to about 36,250 dwellings per annum just to keep up with demand in the city. I understand and London might be able to verify that, but we compare to London about 25,000 dwellings a year. So pretty extraordinary. At the moment, we're tracking at about 38,000, so we're above target. We're about 10 years behind. During the GFC, we lost a lot of ground. And a lot of that opportunity is in Western Sydney. But if we're serious about building the next generation city, we need to do it with the structure of the city that works. And at the moment, I have parts of the Western City that you could travel 10 kilometres before you get to an east-west road link, let alone any form of public transport. So we've got a whole new city to build. It will cost billions of dollars to get it right, but we've got an opportunity now to do that, but we've got to do it damn quick.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
I think the way to understand it in London is that the 35% of all jobs in Australia since the crash have come within 3 kilometres of the CBD of Sydney. 35% of all jobs in Australia. But half the population of Sydney live west of Parramatta. The trends going forward are not to have polycentric jobs. The trends going forward are still for the central cities everywhere to be where the jobs are. So we still have to get people from the suburbs into these centres for jobs. And the only thing that does that in a modern economy, in a knowledge economy where jobs are agglomerating, is mass transit. We have to have more ambition about it.
And it's not just the mass transit, though. It's like really, it's not just its integration. We know that rail, in particular, interplays with the land use in a particular way. It shapes it. It causes it to densify. It increases the development capacity and capability. And it's really that density and that intensity of activity that's essentially what productivity is. But we still see, and it's really difficult, even though you have all of that vision there, talking with the various agencies about really using this lever and coordinating those actions together. And this is even when you're talking about government-owned land and they're holding the lever of the rail, they've got their own land. Any rational investor would be seeking to increase the value of their own assets and putting these things together. So, for example, in the state infrastructure strategy, it still put out the rail link to the airport essentially for another 20 years. The reason why it said it would be viable when patronage at the airport increases. Now, that's a pretty big assumption that says that this rail line is only functioning there in order to service the airport, rather than really looking at that as a lever to achieve the objectives out of the city deal. And the city deal objectives, quite frankly, are employment, like how many jobs and the density of that employment and houses. So the question is how can a rail line drive that kind of land use? Your second question is, what's the optimum transport solution in order to link these? They've still got the question a bit back to front.
Thanks, Alice. Look, I am seeing some questions from the audience, and I can see James Warwick, Professor of Landscape Architecture.
Philip, can I interrupt a moment? We need to just move on to the London panel, then we'll come back to your questions in a moment. Okay? Yeah, so perhaps I could ask Richard and Gordon then to respond with their views on, what do you think we can learn from Sydney and things you've heard this morning. Richard?
I think it's a fascinating discussion because it feels like the Greater Sydney discussion is quite similar to the discussion that's growing about London and the wider South East, and Darren alluded to some of that in his presentation of the London plan. And London, in a way, has been in tension between agglomeration and polycentricity, if that's the right phrase, for the period of London planning, and generally agglomeration, or at least economic agglomeration, as one. There's been a strong focus on the central activities zone and on consolidating business functions there. I think you start to see some changes in the latest London plan. I think the references to Old Oak Common and Stratford as reserve locations for offices starts to express that London could become a multi-hub city over time as much as a single hub city, and I think that's a significant long-term change. And I think there's also a parallel change in terms of the residential distribution, where having for a period been a few big sites in central London have built at very high densities, the focus on suburban densification, on perhaps looking at that 4 to 6 story Australian typology, especially if we get the weather with it, that 4 to 6 story typology, much more widespread across the suburbs, but as in Australia, as in Sydney, a matter of political controversy both on the left and the right. I think that's going to be a big battle for the mayor and for the boroughs in coming years. But I think, so that London, which has stayed quite agglomerated, is seen in the bigger context of the southeast. I mean, commuting has grown. We're a long way from being a 30-minute city. More than 50% of London's commuters travel for more than 30 minutes, and a significant proportion for more than an hour. So London, because of its green belt, because it's bounded by this green belt around the outside, has started to be part of a polycentric conurbation in southeast England. And if you look at cities like Brighton, where I commuted in from this morning, Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes, London is starting to form a larger city region with those. That creates challenges. There's a better dialogue going on between the GLA and the surrounding authorities now. But that can lead to accusations of dumping, of getting the housing but not the infrastructure. So that is a conversation that needs to mature, perhaps in the way this is in Sydney. And it's also putting pressure on some of those towns where they have local wages but London house prices. So London has kind of grown organically into a bigger conurbation over the past 15 years. And the political dialogue is just, in a way, starting to catch up with that.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you, Peter. Can I just say how much I'm enjoying this session as someone who grew up in Australia and started my career there, studied there, and Sydney was my main centre, to then have come to London. To see this event as a comparison, I think is brilliant and really useful. But I think the two things that I take away are both relate to space and culture. I think out of all the stats that I saw from the presentation this morning, the one that really struck home to me was the geographical size difference between Sydney and London. So in terms of space, one of them is public transport and commuting and the use of the car. When I first got to London many years ago travelling, I caused a dinner party. People dropped cutlery because I said I loved the tube. And all the locals were quite surprised about that. But I'd come from a car-based society where you would just jumped in the car and you drove places. So having that change and that freedom that public transport brings, I think is a key difference between London and Sydney. But I think a part of that is also culture, and a part of it is the fact that Sydney was able to just spread because there was land, there was space. This is the luxury that London doesn't have. And certainly from my own current personal, professional perspective at the power station, we would not have done our project without a significant public transport intervention, which was an extension to the Northern Line, and we would have made sure that that happened, because otherwise you couldn't get the 10 million square feet of development that we've got on our project. And a related point to that is it's not just us. I think attitudes are changing as well, and employers are changing as well. Our key tenant is Apple, so they've got their headquarters in our 6 floors of office space in the power station. And an exercise we had to go through was to make an assessment of where all their employees were at the moment and what their commutes were, and then do an assessment to make sure that their commutes weren't worse off in moving to the power station with the Northern Line extension. And then the second point relating to space and culture is density. In Australia, you're sold that it's the great Australian dream is the quarter-acre block. And that's been sort of built into everyone's psyche. But quarter-acre block, as you can see from the size of Sydney, takes up a lot of space. And you compare that with London, I think there's a key comparator there. And I think that the final point is that I think that the bit that Sydney has against it is not only the CBD, with everyone mainly commuting into the CBD, but the CBD is on the coast. So you've even got even worse, because you've got sort of half a circle to deal with.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. So if the people in London want to ask a question, put up their hand, but we'll go back to Sydney now, because Philip, I think you've got a couple of people who do want to ask questions of our panels.
Yes, thanks, Peter. We have James Werrick, Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design from the University of New South Wales.
Yes, thank you, Vivian, and thanks to everyone in London for a great discussion. What we're seeing clearly is a convergence of expert opinion that the polynucleated city served by public transport is the only solution for the 21st century city of any scale. I think it's great to see in London that there's more reality over rhetoric in such a plan, but I'm wondering whether in Sydney there's more rhetoric over reality. And I think the word convergence, unfortunately, applies very much to something that hasn't been mentioned by Sarah Hill, but perhaps it's implied by what Tim Williams is mentioning, that our state government has been committed to building radial roads, freeways, converging on the centre of the city. And unfortunately, the Greater Sydney Commission, which is a magnificent organisation, perhaps the best since the Cumberland County Council in terms of understanding our total metropolitan area, may in fact suffer the fate of the Cumberland County Council and be overwhelmed by the reality of what's really happening rather than what they wish happens. And so I'm surprised that they haven't had the courage to come out against the WestConnex and associated converging radial freeways. And the chair, in fact, of the Greater Sydney Commission endorsed this outrageous plan. But the big reality is, how are you going to fund the public transport network that the city needs? One obvious way is to stop the 20 billion plus being wasted on WestConnex and put that immediately into your railway that you need. So over to Sarah Hill on that.
Well, indeed, there is a question of fact and reality in some of that I must say. But look, certainly we need to look forward, and certainly there are things that we need to address going forward, and building a city that has more forms of infrastructure across all variety of needs is important to Sydney-siders. So we need to look forward, and we do need to implement the plan, and we do need public transport as much as we need schools and we need health. And so that's our focus going forward. How do you fund it? That's a bloody good question. Okay. And that's something we've got to look seriously at, and that's certainly something that is the elephant in the room, and no one's going to have the
Can I make a comment on what Jane's raising? It seems to me the federal government's getting more involved in cities. I think the one thing they should fund is Metro Rail, on the condition that stacks of development happens along the Metro Rails. And that's, I think, the big game changer for all our cities. As you can see with London, with its underground, switches off the car as a dominant use.
In fact, we've got our first Commonwealth-funded North-South rail line that we have now with the City deal. So, the world is changing. And we are starting to address that. But absolutely, there is a deficit in funding. If we had a magic wand, we would.
It was strangely reassuring hearing from London that where they have made no progress whatsoever since I left is in other infrastructure planning. The utilities are still a mystery. And it's delightful to hear that, actually, because everything else sounded quite good. But that's obviously crazy still.
Right, Philip,
and
can
the London Mayor, and despite the fact I think that actually Sydney needs coordinated metropolitan governance going forward, and the GSC I see as a step towards. And London is a far better place since it had that. It still hasn't solved the other utilities and the coordinated around that needs to happen. And I think Sarah's got some interesting ideas about trying to get some compacts with utility providers in the growth infrastructure compacts. Would you like to say a bit about that?
Tim, that's a really good idea. So
right, can we interrupt for a moment? We're running out of time. We've got a question here, and then we'll come back to Sydney for a second question there. So, question here, thank you.
Corinne Swain, a strategic planner at Arup. Question about governance structures, please. We've just heard a compliment to the mayoral family in relation to the GLA area. But given that Greater Sydney is more similar in area terms to London and its wider hinterland, a question to the London panel: what can we learn from the idea of an independent commission, as in the Greater Sydney Commission? We have very limited dialogue across the London boundary at the moment. And a question perhaps to the Sydney panel: how did you get over accusations of a democratic deficit in terms of the idea of an independent expert commission? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let's just start. Who would like to respond to the question about an independent commission for London? Anyone? Yeah, Gordon.
I'll have a go. I think your point is right, is that someone else made the point earlier about actually the home counties around London. So many people commute in from there that they're a key part of the conversation. I don't know the answer, but one thing I will add to that is in terms of infrastructure and further growth, Crossrail 2 will seem to have an insurmountable benefit to areas outside of London, and yet it'll be London who will probably be looked at the moment through mayoral Sill to pay for it. So I think there should be a wider discussion in terms of cross-borough, sort of out of London discussions.
Yes, perhaps I could ask Darren. I mean, how do you deal with we have a government that doesn't really believe in regional planning these days, yet there are lots of developments happening in the outer areas. I mean, how do you coordinate that from your own thinking?
Well, we've been taking it on hands to have those discussions with the wider southeast. So we have for a number of years now had discussions with the representative groups of the two regions that surround London, and there was a summit earlier this year that the mayor attended where we got representatives from all the planning authorities from surrounding London, and we're slowly working on a key set of infrastructure priorities that we want to present to government, but also around common themes around delivery and barriers to delivery, because often the key theme that we're looking at that's consistent both in London and outside London is encouraging developers to build out their permissions. And one of the things we're looking at is what are the barriers to that happening, and are there common themes that we can jointly lobby government, whether it's new powers or whether it's funding for infrastructure. So the arrangements they're maturing, but they have to be done by consent because we're dealing with democratic bodies, and there are a lot of planning authorities outside London, so we've got to work with them in a democratic way. It isn't for the mayor to impose anything outside London, so we have to do it by consensus.
Thanks very much. Right, over to Sydney to respond about the democratic deficit, I think.
I think that's a question for Sarah.
Well, it's certainly something that a lot of people in initial stages of the GSC recognised as important, and I know it's something that Tim has championed about the evolution of our organisation. But there's probably two key ways that we've worked very hard to address it. The first one is that 6 of our commissioners, or 5 now, as we have 5 districts for Greater Sydney, are actually nominated by council, selected by councils, and all were nominated and agreed to by the state government without any difference in the setup of the GSC. And they represent their districts and the local councils that nominated them. So that's number one. But number two, I learned very much from my time in East London and working on the master plan for the Olympics and Stratford City, another thing that doesn't change much, back working on Stratford City, which is still trying to do everything that it can to rebalance some of those employment opportunities in East London. But the second big thing I learned is to respect local government and to bring local government into the commission. So I'm very proud to say that our plans were written by local government with us. In fact, we had 15 of the 33 councils in Greater Sydney actually second people into our team to co-write the plan with us, and that enabled us to understand really what the local features of the city were, the local opportunities and challenges, and to represent that local flavour and that local knowledge, which is so critical. We didn't preach, we learned, and we did it together. Collaboration is key to what we do.
Can I just add a comment on that? Because I showed some images from last Sunday's paper that surveys show 60% think it's overdevelopment, and there's a big community backlash. I keep reading around the place about this. So I can understand the theory of it and how it's all in the numbers, 725,000 over 20 years, and all these sort of things. But I think there's a real fundamental problem about this shift to a more urban city is not necessarily wanted by a lot of people in a more suburban city. And so there's a fundamental communication issue somehow about this. And I know you've worked with the councils and they're the ones who should be championing this, but I sense many local politicians are starting to exploit this scare campaign, this negativity.
Thanks, Chris. I think we have a quick comment from Tim and then another question.
Yes, I was going to say, I think on that democratic principle that some of the people across Sydney actually welcomed an independent arbitrator into the picture. And let's not forget that it is actually a statutory authority underpinned by a strong legislation. I think there are powers in there embedded they're actually choosing not to exercise at this point. Where some of things were unfair, or the disparities, I'd say some areas are experiencing growth and others aren't getting all of those pains. They're getting squeezed, others aren't. And this is because it's down at it's treated differently at the local government level. Who takes that bigger view picture about the growth and the benefits and how they're shared, and also some of the pain that might come with that. The other aspect is that really getting that arbitration across and between government agencies, really getting that horizontal integration. So you have distinct government agencies with their 10-year budget plans, they're asking different questions and they've all got different objectives. How is that all lined up into a unified plan for growth and for livability in communities? That wasn't happening before. I think GSC's intervention is quite welcome.
So I think the issue in Sydney is not just the democratic deficit, it's actually the lack of coordination between government agencies. And when people object to growth, Chris, I think they're not just objecting to growth, they're objecting to bad, terrible growth. And I think it's not density, it's density done badly that is the problem. And a lot of that is not to be fair, it's not a private sector architecture problem, it's a failure of the public sector to provide infrastructure and the urban quality around that was promised. So I think that we are lacking at the moment a social license to grow the city because we've done it badly. And I think the GSC is part of rowing back, actually, towards doing it well. and it's on its journey, I think, to a more accountable nature, and it's linked with local government, which I think is probably stronger than the GLA link with local government in London, by the way, which I always thought was quite adversarial, and actually hadn't really involved local government enough, I think, in drawing up the London plan. So I think we're actually got some... Sydney's better, actually, I've discovered, in that respect than my London experience. Although 8 years on, I'm totally out of date, obviously.
Right, Philip, could I ask you to just sum up now? We're running a bit over time, so if you'd like to draw any comments from that before we close proceedings.
Certainly, Peter. Well, thank you. I think we've had a fascinating session. It's been excellent to hear about the plan for London and the Greater Sydney Commission's vision for Sydney. We've also heard from Transport for London about how they are integrating transport and their future development opportunities. And in Sydney, we've heard from the development group. So I think we've really heard from a wide audience about the need to integrate density and transport and really, ideally, have infrastructure lead development, not vice versa. And I think it's been fascinating certainly for us to hear the London example, and I hope it's been interesting for you in London to hear what we are doing to plan our city for the exponential growth that we're experiencing. Thank you, Peter.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Philip, for both hosting us and chairing the proceedings in Sydney. I think fascinating discussion and fascinating comparisons between the city. I liked a couple of comments. Rhetoric over reality seems to be something which happens a lot as we try to deal with growth in cities. And the comparison transport-led development or development-led transport, which I thought was a really nice comment. But also, clearly, I think as we start developing in lower density areas, the conflicts with local communities is going to be a key issue and something that probably we can share more of these discussions in future years. So thank you very much to our audience in Sydney. Thank you very much for everyone in London, and particularly to all our speakers. Thank you.